women physicians in academic medicine earn 67 to 77 cents on the dollar compared with their male colleagues, and women physicians, regardless of race or ethnicity, earn less than men of every race and ethnicity. This is a big problem.
You're back at the Faculty Factory podcast, and this is going to be a good one, folks. I'm Kim Skorupski here at Hopkins. And guess who's with us today? Dr. Amy Gottlieb. Hi, Amy.
Hi, great to see you again.
Well, Amy Gottlieb was here back in September of 2019. You want to check out her episode. It's episode number 37 that dropped October 4th, 2019. And in that episode, Amy talked about really important, timely events, and who knew they were going to be as timely as they are now. Allyship, the tincture of time, and how we bend toward justice, parental leave, job negotiation, sponsorship, corporate finance. She taught me a lot. How Amy said she's an avid reader of the business literature, which really got me thinking about that's a gap in my portfolio. Talked about sponsorship and proteges. So many important ideas, concepts, and they've turned out to be really, really important. And let me just start. I'm so excited. Let me tell you, first of all, Dr. Amy Gottlieb is the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs, a professor of medicine and obstetrics and gynecology, Chief Faculty Development Officer at Baystate Health and University of Massachusetts Medical School. Is that right, Amy?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. Although we do have a new name for UMass. It's UMass Chan Medical School, Baystate now.
UMass Chan
Medical School.
All right. I got that. Now, Dr. Gottlieb recently published a book, Closing the Gender Pay Gap, and produced an article on the same topic. She's been thinking really hard on equity and gender. And this has been your passion for the past couple of years. You've been on the national speaking tour, zooming in and out everywhere, as well as Hopkins last summer. And I think this is a great place to just let's get right into it, Amy. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for being back again. And I'm super excited.
Well, thank you so much. It's just really great to connect. A lot has happened. Wow, so much has happened in the world, Kim, since September 2019. And as you mentioned, I've continued to immerse myself in scholarship and advocacy related to gender equity in medicine and science, now with a really sharp focus around closing the gender pay gap in medicine. And I want to thank you for mentioning the book I published last year, which is Closing the Gender Pay Gap in Medicine, a roadmap for healthcare organizations and the women physicians who work for them. I have been just tremendously lucky to have had the opportunity through that book and an article on the same topic that I published in the New England Journal last year to meet and engage and speak with academic medicine leaders and faculty nationwide around this topic that I care deeply about, which is pay equity in our field.
And it's also perfect timing. I need to mention, those of you who know the AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges, GWIMS group on women in medical science.
In medicine and science. Yep.
I was in the GFA, the group on faculty affairs, but Dr. Amy Gottlieb is the chair-elect for GWIM. So this is all coming together. Isn't it a beautiful thing when things just happen? So this is perfect timing.
It's really wonderful. And I will say, I want to give out a major shout out to the AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges, because it's really through them that I had the opportunity to become really involved in this effort around salary equity. As your listeners may recall, I began my professional life in corporate finance and then left to pursue a career in medicine. And, really closing the gender pay gap reflects the intersection of my professional skills, leadership experience, and passion around equity, inclusion, and supporting the success of women in medicine and science. And the AAMC has really been a thought leader around raising the level of conversation and transparency related to pay equity in medicine and science. And through my work with the group on women in medicine and science, have really been invited to participate in a lot of those initiatives. And so thank you for mentioning the AAMC. They've really been just an incredible leader in this space.
Well, thank you for your leadership. These are not paid positions, folks. So thank you so much, Amy. So what do you want to talk about today? There's so much, and I'm going to try to be really quiet and let you lead the conversation here because it's super important.
Well, thank you so much. I would like to, I guess, a couple of things. The first thing is to acknowledge that the pandemic has really been an incredibly busy time for all of us, and none more than women physicians who, like women in the labor market writ large, have had to shoulder the responsibility of daycare and school closures and remote learning throughout the pandemic. And this has resulted in, as I'm sure you know, reduced work hours and decreased academic productivity. And throughout all of that, the gender pay gap has continued to widen. And so I like to think about the gender pay gap as a crucible in which all the forces that diminish women's professional value within our society and within our professional institutions converge. And this is really true in medicine, where there are multiple inflection points in women's career trajectories where our traditional way of paying folks, of valuing the work that they do, disproportionately rewards the way men, physicians, and faculty have worked and lived for generations. And so, I think it's really critical, and it's quite honestly my life's mission to help institutions and individuals identify and acknowledge and address these contextual forces, as we said, about correcting the practice of paying equally talented women less than their male counterparts. Women physicians in academic medicine earn 67 to 77 cents on the dollar compared with their male colleagues, and women physicians, regardless of race or ethnicity, earn less than men of every race and ethnicity. This is a big problem.
So why do we still have this problem, Amy? I feel like we've been talking about this for decades. Why? Let's assume it's not
intentional, right? It's not intentional, right? Yeah.
Because I have heard things like, well, it's because women just don't want to work as hard as they choose. They choose not to take the extra OR time, or they choose not to go into the high-paying specialties. It's a conscious decision to select or volunteer to not get that kind of money. Is there truth to that?
So I thank you you essentially just summarized all the cultural narratives. This is wonderful around the gender pay gap. So let me just start unpacking each of them. So first of all, the data that I quoted, the 67 to 77 cents on the dollar, or a number that folks may also hear, which is data put out by Doximeter, which is not just academic docs. In fact, it's mostly non-academic docs across the country. 72 cents on the dollar women physicians earn. So it's even more striking. So those numbers, and you're right, there has been decades of data, rigorous data, controlled data looking at this. So the pay disparity numbers that I mentioned and that one reads about are numbers that have been controlled for work hours, for specialty, for rank, for years in practice. So those numbers, that pay gap is real, and it's not based on all the elements that you have reflected that have been the cultural narrative. I will say a couple of things. So one, why are we still struggling with this? I think there are two primary reasons. One is relates specifically to compensation methodology within medicine. So typically, compensation methodology in our field rests on a formula of base salary, productivity, rank and seniority, and leadership. And this calculus contribute structurally to gender-based salary inequities because of women's diminished earning potential in each of those domains. So what do I mean by that? So for example, base salary typically there is considerable difference between a base salary low end and high end of a stated benchmark range, for example. And there is a lot of opportunity to be placed higher in that range based on salary expectations and vigorousness of negotiation. And that's critical to establishing, for example, initial salary at higher. And those elements, negotiation and salary expectations, we know from decades of data and research, are subject potentially and vulnerable to gender bias. Another example is productivity-based compensation, which is impacted negatively by increased demands on women for organizational service, increased time spent with patients, but resulting in better outcomes, but lower volumes, and greater responsibility for domestic duties compared with male colleagues. And then last but not least, limited formal leadership roles and less sponsorship for those roles to access those roles decreases the compensation that necessarily attaches to these opportunities. So again, the calculus of base salary, productivity, salary and rank, and leadership opportunity inherently has disparities that result in compensation inequities. I also want to just address one comment that you made, which was really insightful, which is this idea of women entering fields that in medicine and science that are less highly compensated. And that is a concept, Kim, called occupational gender segregation. And you're absolutely right that there is emerging evidence that women trainees continue to be directed towards specialties like pediatrics that require traditionally feminine attributes and away from more procedural ones, like, for example, orthopedics. So this concept or this phenomenon of occupational gender segregation has tremendous consequences for pay equity because in the U.S. labor market as a whole, we have seen a loss of prestige and a decline in earnings as more and more women enter a field or occupation. So when an entire specialty loses ground in terms of relative pay, and that's reflected in these salary benchmarks that we're using to set base compensation, when that happens, the earning potential of all women entering that field is put at considerable risk. So that's kind of bucket one, which is we have to organizations really need to rethink how they are compensating their physicians and faculty to understand the expectations that are driving that compensation calculus and the outcomes that they generate. And then the other bucket really is that I think nobody would argue with the concept of equal pay for equal work, but it's really how to achieve that goal that overwhelms institutions and their leaders. Organizations need a roadmap. That's literally why I wrote the book. And it is very practical. And I intentionally, I edited the book. I was approached to write the book. And I thought to myself, there have been so many articles, so much written about the problem, and what's been missing from the conversation is the solution, how to solve the problem. And so I engaged experts in the field of compensation around the country. And by experts in the field, I mean folks who are not just vice presidents in HR, but an attorney, an employment attorney, folks who really know, who could really come up with a roadmap for organizations to, as I said, assess how their current compensation methodologies are perpetuating pay inequities, how to build the governance structures and coalitions and processes that are going to be necessary to incorporate equity principles into routine business practices, and how to create the dialogue and consistent messaging and cascaded information to achieve organizational transformation in this space. This is not something that's one and done.
Amy, thank you so much for doing this hard work and thinking and digesting all the literature and the data and putting everything into historical context. I'm so impressed and just awed by the work that you've done with this book, and it's so important. And I'm so glad you kind of led into this, telling us how you did this, exploring compensation models. And because I was curious, in your personal history of corporate finance, I can't help but think there has to be, someone has figured this out. And you fill in the blank with whatever this is. Now, I remember being with my buddy Charlie Irvin in Chicago for one of the and we had a session on precision faculty development. And I went on one of my little diatribes about, Amazon.com knows so much about me. They communicate with me when my order was placed, when it's being filled, when it's being mailed, when it was delivered. It was just put on your front doorstep, and it was just stolen from your front doorstep. So you might want to order it again. And because you like this, you might want something similar. And they know all that. And yet our institutions, many of them, ours, like used to not communicate to faculty members of where's your promotion packet in the chain. Right. The common courtesy to tell us what's happening in our careers, these important life events. And then, of course, someone rightly said, well, they're Amazon.com. They have a gajillion dollars, and they are all about consumer marketing. That's how they make their money. And yet then my rebuttal is, well, if they can do it, surely we can do it. We are the some of the best brains in the galaxy. So yes. I know that we can fix this problem.
Yes.
So that because we have the brain power to, it leads me to believe that it's just a decision, a choice to not fix it. So in the corporate world, I mean, again, here's belying my ignorance. I can only imagine in maybe high-priced lawyers. So you've got a whole legal team, and you've got all this, corporate attorneys, and they want to, recruit, retain, and promote the best attorneys. They probably figured out. So these are smart people who are really educated. I imagine they're men and women doing both things, the same jobs. They have a structure for a base salary, and you get your, bonuses based on whatever. It just seems to me, again, belying my ignorance here, other industries have figured this out. And why do we stubbornly in academic medicine resist the obvious, that there are models, that there are ways to do it? And so then why don't we?
Well, I think unfortunately other industries have not figured this out. In fact, you mentioned law, and the legal profession has a gender pay gap too. And I think though that what is both hopeful and maybe revealing for academic medicine is I liken closing the gender pay gap to the QI movement 20 years ago. And so if you think about it, the quality improvement movement really resulted from the Institute of Medicine calling the U.S. medical community to action to prevent deaths related to low quality care. It was an incredibly complex system of interdigitated, interlacing forces that, oh my gosh, people couldn't get their heads around. However, just like QI, gender equity in the last 20 years, gender equity and specifically closing the gender pay gap to progress from exhortation to intentional action is going to require institutions to do what they've done successfully, right? Mostly in QI, they're going to need to measure, they're going to need to report, and they're going to need to align incentives, or what folks may call accountability, for paying women and men who do the same work equally. And I think, you had asked me early on in this conversation, what's driving all of this? And I talked about the traditional compensation methodology of base salary determined by commercially available benchmarks plus additional monetary reward for rank leadership and productivity, and how all the cultural forces impact each of those domains. And so in addition to building institutional cultures in which men and women are not limited by gender role expectations, organizations are going to need to recognize that closing the gender pay gap is also a critical business endeavor, requiring the same attention, the same rigor, and the same attention to detail afforded other operating costs. Labor in healthcare is one of the, if not the biggest operating expense. And so what that means, and what my journey in the last 2 years, so I really started, the book, of course, because this is how life works, right? The book, the chapters to the book were literally due, okay, guess, January, February 2020.
Awesome.
So I spent, looking back, it's really amazing. All of us have these stories about the pandemic, right? The first 4 months of the pandemic were, 24/7, or I guess I'd say 22/7, healthcare institution duties, right? And then getting up for me for the book, at 4 a.m. for an hour and just saying, I'm going to work on a chapter today. I'm going to work on a chapter today. And I think that this was kind of meant to be for me, because now what we've seen coming through the pandemic is that our workforce is so critical. It is the most critical element of sustaining our profession. And what's at the essence of that is paying people, rewarding them fairly for the work that they do.
That's right. Being valued, feeling how faculty need to feel valued, that you are seeing the work I'm doing. I am compensated just like the person next to me. And also this promise of academic medicine. This is the other thing that I'm really, and a lot of us are worried about, that, gosh, people can go to private practice and earn double, triple the salaries. Why would they come into academic medicine? Because there is this promise of getting into discovery and prevention and treatment and cure and science. Where is the science happening in this? In the current and future model of healthcare and all the pressures on our clinical scientists? How does this play out? So I think the one side is certainly the equity in salaries and in compensation, and you have to also look at equity in resources.
Yes.
And opportunities to do the science and to be a leader.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you raised that. So a couple of things. One is, what you're getting at is something that is really important to me, certainly in the genesis of this book, but also in the aftermath of the book and these opportunities that I've had to meet with institutions and institutional leaders and faculty, is that we cannot do this alone. This is going to require tremendous partnerships with HR and finance to understand how to operationalize equity along the career continuum for our physicians, for our faculty, our physicians and scientists. And what I mean by that is you're so right that when I give talks about this, one of the highlights for me is to express the importance of that startup. The data, the salary and resources, the data are really clear and consistent that the gender pay gap starts right out of training. So there's no history, right? Everybody comes with the same background, and yet men are paid more. And then there's also data for startup packages around research. And so institutions, my exhortation is start somewhere, do something. And, to me, one of the best places to start is at that initial hire with resources and comp, because if an institution is expecting ROI, right, return on investment, their investment in this talent, in the workforce, they should want to set that person up for success. And part of that is resource allocation.
Amy, can you shed a little bit of light on the other end? So, most of us who are listening to this podcast are, I assume, academic medicine people and have come up through the ranks. We're all about schooling and education and living the life in the ivory tower. Can you opened my eyes to the other end of our colleagues in HR or in finance when they come up with these algorithms and the calculus for coming up with how something is monetarily valued. How do we bridge that gap with those partners in our institutions to understand that? Is this just basically an economic situation where I don't want to, I mean, economics fascinates me. I don't want to give short shrift to our colleagues who are driving these business models and coming up with all these calculations, but I oftentimes feel like they don't appreciate what it is to do this job. So, and I guess that's just kind of the age-old question. How does one value that relationship with a patient in the room over the RVU that's generated at the bottom of when you're closing the encounter on Epic? How do we, and this kind of maybe is where we all went awry. Where do the faculty members come into the calculation, the essence of what we do? As you said the word essence earlier, that made me think of this as I fear that we don't, we have not communicated that well enough, or they don't care. The finance people just don't get it, or they're not really, that's not in their purview to truly understand what it is we do. Am I making any sense?
You are making a total sense. And what you're getting at is the RVU as a measure of productivity, and how are we measuring productivity? And, I think, so I have a couple of responses to that. You are totally on the right train in that kind of 10,000 foot view, which is that how to compensate physician faculty in 21st century healthcare really needs to look very different from the time-honored model of volume-based productivity, and that the RVU is really I'm going to reveal my bias here. I'm not the only one. There's a lot of conversation about this. It's a problematic metric, mostly because it was not designed to value or to measure physician productivity. It was designed in the early 90s to be a form of kind of a rubric for payment for services, which part of which is physician work, some of it's location and infrastructure, et cetera. There are a lot of different domains that go into RVU, and as such, it's physician work, practice expense, and professional liability. Those are kind of the major components of RVU valuation. And the metric itself, besides not being designed to measure physician productivity, is also kind of has some methodologic problems because it's based on survey and reports, and it's subjective. So if we kind of leave that piece alone and look at what you're talking about, which is how should we think about what's productive in 21st century healthcare? I think we've learned that a volume-based metric like an RVU is not ideal. Number one, because as we've seen, pushing physicians more to see more and more patients not only doesn't help quality, but it has led, one could argue, to a tremendous amount of burnout. And some folks even say that, it potentially monetizes the doctor-patient relationship. I would say for women physicians, it really has, the RVU model has tremendous potential to perpetuate the gender pay gap for all the reasons that I mentioned in terms of inherent disparities with for women physicians in terms of the amount of time they spend with patients, resulting in better quality, but fewer volumes, having increased demands for organizational service, taking themselves away from kind of clinical revenue generating by RVU standpoints. And then last but not least, what you said, the RVU system highly rewards procedural specialties, and women for the reasons I stated around occupation, gender segregation may not have access to those. So what do? What do our HR and finance colleagues do in terms of thinking about different models for productivity? Well, quality.
Yes.
I mean, there's so many potentials that align with our 21st century healthcare values. Patient experience, although, we'd have to think about how to quantify that. I would argue citizenship as well. And so I think that there have to be those conversations around what's the mission, what are the values of an institution, and how can we make the compensation align with that? I mean, an institution also may say, equity is a value of ours, and if equity is a value, then what does compensation look like in that rubric?
And then tying all of that to the faculty members' promotion possibilities. I mean, then making sure those are all linked. I imagine an institution or a school's mission that might say, yes, we value quality, experience, citizenship, equity. And then there's a direct line item to how we have the indicators that measure that at the patient level, in the lab level, in the classroom, at the bedside.
Yep.
In the staff, in the departments, all those measurements, what does that look like in each of those domains? How do we compensate for that? And then how do we promote around that? That seems to me that would tie that up nicely.
And I think that's so well said. And I think what you've just described is kind of reflects what early on, when you said, why aren't organizations doing this? And like QI, it's because what you just described, that trajectory is, complex, right? And iterative. And so, I think institutions and institutional leaders should not be deterred from adopting a strategic vision to compensate their physicians and faculty equitably, and to recognize that, overturning practices and implicit biases that have been in place for decades, if not centuries, will take time. And so they have to start somewhere and start with something and stay focused. And so in that beautiful description that you mentioned, choosing one of those elements, how are we defining productivity in the lab? How are we defining productivity in the outpatient setting? And really digging deep and avoiding the temptation to fix everything at once. This is the QI process at its best. It's plan, do, study, act, right? Ongoing evaluation, discussion and feedback, remediation, continuous process improvement. And of course, there has to be a governance structure at the top that is keeping its eye on the strategic vision, but all of the nitty gritty, starting somewhere, doing something, is the devil is in the details, and it takes time and partnerships.
Oh, Amy, I love how you wove in the quality improvement, TQM, total quality management, CQI, continuous quality improvement, all that stuff from way back when, the plan, do, study, act. You're so right. That's a really good model. And I think what you're saying is also making me realize that it's who's asking the questions, that we have to ask curious questions, but who is at the table sharing their experiences of that model is one thing. So that's where, we get task forces and committees to look at things that come up with these recommendations. And then sometimes we're never quite sure how those recommendations are implemented and who's making the decisions to say, if we think there should be some new algorithm for thus and such, and it should take into account equity and quality experience. Okay, sounds great. And then how does that get implemented? Who is then making the decision? Who is then?
And what are the metrics for that? So, so the whole patient experience thing is complicated, right? And you need people at the table to say, well, patient experience, of course, that's a mission and a value for us. However, what's the bias inherent in the measurement of that? So, we know from good research in our space that in academic medicine, that women, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because women physicians may be more vulnerable to higher expectations around the patient experience than their male colleagues. And so how, the data is only good as the input, right? So, or the metric is only as good as the data. And so just to your point, having the right people at the table to weigh in on all the potential drivers of a metric, of a compensation metric, is so critical for closing the pay gap, the gender pay gap in perpetuity. It's not simple because it's costly, but it's relatively simple to say, okay, we're going to conduct a salary audit and we're going to identify the disparities and make them whole. But then what happens next year and the year after and the year after?
To me, I can't lose, or I don't think we can lose by having the diverse and again, its broadest sense of diversity, age and ability and degree types and backgrounds to play these things forward. I was just trying to remember, I was talking to Silk Soto Santiago, the vice chair for faculty affairs, development and diversity at Indiana University, on the podcast. And she talks about leading with wellness and equity. And it was a really great conversation. Laura Schweitzer recommended we talk with her, and she was really talking about these biases. And we were talking about a colleague of mine back at Rush University Medical Center, Paul Carvey, who whenever he would teach about how to write grants, he'd always say, play it forward, play it forward, play it forward.
Right.
When you have a scientific question or a hypothesis, play it forward. Any good program planning, or I imagine anybody in the military, you play that situation forward. If then what? If this, then what? If this, then what? And think ahead, think ahead. So, Amy, what you're talking about is also making me reflect on this, that let's play it, whatever the it is, as you say, so nicely and concisely and beautifully, start somewhere, do something. If we pick one thing, let's play it forward, and let's have all the people at the table in various levels to help us think about where are we going to go. Whoopsie, didn't think about that.
Right.
And the classic whoopsie is when I remember being in faculty senate, they're talking about promotion and how many letters of recommendation and how many letters of referral and endorsement one needs. And in this clinical excellence track, you need some letters from your patients. And then a hand was raised, and it was one of our wonderful doctors who said, I work with homeless populations. I can tell you right now, I'm not going to be able to give you an address for my patients to then contact them.
There you go, right?
Write me a letter of recommendation. Not going to happen. So where does that put me? And everybody kind of like, oh, that's interesting. It's a good example of playing it forward. We need the voices that will go, hello, have you thought about whoopsie? No, because my biases, my framework, my lens drove me right to that conclusion. Yours drove you to that conclusion. And there's so many different ways of looking at things. And if we don't have all the eyes and ears and heads at the table, we're going to have a whoopsie that when it goes forward, we have something like the RVUs, where we have a bunch of, overworked, undervalued, underappreciated automatons on an assembly line. And they're saying, wait a minute, what am I doing? Why did I come here? Where's my science? Where's my heart? Where's my passion? What's happening?
And what you said, is earlier, we should be well placed in academic medicine to tackle this, because we are so good at the why, right? And that playing it forward and what happens and why and why and why. We just have to turn our attention to it.
Yeah. Oh, Amy Gottlieb. Start somewhere, do something. That's easy. Let's just pick one thing. We don't have to do all of the things, but one thing. Thank you. Amy Gottlieb, do you have any parting thoughts for the Faculty Factory podcast audience? Otherwise, I'm just going to keep yammering, and we're going to be here for hours and people will tune out.
I just want to say, because we have spent a lot of time, I'm a systems-based change person, always have been. I do believe wholeheartedly that the primary responsibility for closing the gender pay gap rests squarely on the shoulders of our institutions for all the reasons that you and I have talked about. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't just mention something about what individuals can do, because individuals are listening to this.
Okay.
On an individual level, I really do believe that the most critical contributor to pay equity is understanding the playing field, the rules of the game. Folks really need to know that, there are commercially available benchmark salary data sets that institutions rely on. One of the biggest ones in academic medicine is the AAMC Faculty Salary Survey. Individuals need to understand that, and they need to understand where their organization, what their target benchmark range is within that salary data set, and what are the metrics for placing individuals within those benchmark ranges, because that's all about knowing your worth as an individual contributor. And I think we as a profession could do a lot better in terms of educating our trainees around this particular element of, career satisfaction.
That's right. Thank you, Amy, for reminding us of that, and not keeping it a secret. Once one of us learns about the salaries book and what the ranges are, it's not getting something for you will take away something from someone else. The pie, you grow the pie by sharing the knowledge. There should be no secrets. And that's always our motto. This is not a secret. The salary book data are available. Here at Hopkins, we have copies all over the Baystate suites and the library. We have the online version. Faculty simply ask us. We send them the pages and all the relevant data for them. And we tell them, this is not a secret. Share it. You have an obligation when you learn something good to pass it to the folks who are a tick behind you on the ladder, and hopefully bring people up to speed so that we're all at least on the same starting field. It still breaks your heart when you hear people go, oh, I didn't realize that I could ask for more money. I didn't realize I could ask for something. And I always think, are you kidding me? Who by now has not heard this basic thing? And there's still people who's like, oh, I didn't know they told me the salary was this. And I said, okay, sounds good. Oh.
And, I think that this, maybe I come to this very practically because of my experience in corporate finance, that the best advice I actually ever got about talking about salary was for folks in academic medicine was to approach a conversation about one's salary as if you were reading a journal article and asking about the methods section.
Huh.
Because think about it. You would not be, most of the audience here today probably, reads journal articles consistently and looks at that method section. And if that method section, and, they didn't understand something, they say, hey, tell me a little bit about what drove that decision. It's literally the same thing. And with salary. And so tell me, as an individual, having that appreciative inquiry around, so here's the salary you're offering, what's the benchmark that you're using, and what's the target, and what makes it fall within that, within that range.
Wow.
De-escalates it a little bit, right?
Right. That changes a whole interview dynamic or approach. And wouldn't it be nice, though, as you pointed out earlier about giving fair, to be honest, to be equal, responsibility on both ends, the institution writ large and the individual the same way? Wouldn't it be lovely if all of the responsibility weren't on the individual to say, all right, is she coming into this bringing guns a-blazing? Or does she not know anything? And how can we play this? Rather just saying, here it is. Here are our books. This is what our compensation plan looks like. We got the best methods paper written about it. They're appendiceal material. We have no secrets. These are the different models. This is how this looks. Wouldn't that be a mind-blowing experience if you were to interview for jobs and everyone just had this? Right.
Well, that's my holy grail. And, there are, there is at least one that I'm aware of, institution, the Mayo Clinic, that is a salary only model. And that's very transparent about, this is what the salary is for the specialty. And, within a certain number of years, everyone, they've published about this. And, everyone within a certain specialty gets the same base pay. And I do think that institutions, in order to move the needle and close the gender pay gap, are really going to need to pay attention to those initial hiring conversations to really audit that those metrics and dig deep into the processes that are creating any inequities. And your point is absolutely right. Having transparency in those initial conversations is a major step in the right direction. Look, here's our benchmark. Here's the range. Here's where you fall based on X, Y, and Z. Wouldn't that be a beautiful thing?
Yeah, right. Wow. So much that we can do. There's so much work to be done. And I'm so glad Dr. Amy Gottlieb is leading the charge. I can't wait to see all the great work you do at GWIMS. Friends on the Faculty Factory podcast, you're going to want to check out Closing the Gender Pay Gap in Medicine, this book. Earth-shaking, groundbreaking. We needed it. I'm so glad you did it. And the accompanying New England Journal Medicine article, though they will both be linked in the Faculty Factory podcast episode, pointing to Amy's episode. And look at her past one, number 37, back in October 2019. So good, Amy. You are so smart. Thank you for being on the podcast and for being part of our community and helping us ask these important questions. Start somewhere, do something, right, Amy?
Yeah. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It is wonderful to see you again.
See you next time on the Faculty Factory podcast, friends. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Faculty Factory Podcast. The mission of the Faculty Factory is to build and support a community of leaders in faculty development who share tools, resources, wisdom, and encouragement in service to our faculty members, schools, and institutions. We encourage you to go to facultyfactory.org to find out more. Get in touch with me, ask me any questions. Maybe you want to be interviewed on the podcast. Thanks for tuning in to Faculty Factory Podcast. We'll see you next time. The Faculty Factory podcast and website is sponsored by the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine Office of Faculty. For more information, visit facultyfactory.org.